Valley of Bones. Fresh from a ride on a Nazi submarine, Indiana Jones is persuaded by a beautiful missionary to search for her missing father in Mongolia. Professor Angus Starbuck has discovered a dinosaur bone in the Gobi Desert, but unlike other such discoveries, this bone isn't ancient. As Indy crosses from China through a treacherous mountain pass to outer Mongolia, he runs afoul of the region's fiercest warlords. Meanwhile, the world's last innocent people, dwelling in a Stone Age paradise, are poised on the brink of destruction. Suddenly, Indiana Jones is dueling wild dogs and bloodthirsty killers in a desperate effort to save the most historic discovery of the 20th century, the last living Triceratops. An impossible discovery lures Indy on a journey towards certain extinction. Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs.
Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is my next in discussing the Indiana Jones Bantam novels. So I'm here to talk about the 10th book, Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs, which was the second to be written by Max McCoy, who was the third and final author of the Indy books. So there are, of course, 12 Bantam novels, so we're nearing the end of the Bantam books. And quite frankly, just like the last book, McCoy is the first author who actually gets the spirit and tone of the Indiana Jones films that we know and love. So if you come to the Bantam books and you're reading them chronologically, which I would say is a good idea because there is a loose chronology, you're going to be waiting a while to get something that's more indie of the films in tone and flavor. While Rob McGregor does some great character building, and those books start in the 20s, so they are very much prequels. Well, I mean, all of these are prequels, but that's a much younger Indy. They're kind of hit or miss in terms of feeling like the films. And then the two Martin Caidin books are appallingly bad, and I would not recommend anybody read them unless you're a diehard Indy fan and you're determined to read all the Bantam books. And if you're gonna read them, you should just go ahead, and then you're gonna regret it, but you should just get it over with. So it's a relief getting to these McCoy books. And in Philosopher's Stone, I was surprised that it was the first book that had the indie film flavor. And while I don't think it was as strongly plotted as I would have liked, and I do think there are some issues there, it was still a fun adventure book, finally. And that is enhanced even more here in Dinosaur Eggs. You would think going in that the book called Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs would probably be kind of dumb or one of the worst books, but this is even better than Philosopher's Stone. And in fact, I would say McCoy here absolutely nails the tone of an Indiana Jones movie. Particularly, he absolutely nails the humor of Indy. So I think Indy here in this book is the closest of any of the books so far to the Indy of the films. It's also set in 1933, so we're getting very close to Temple of Doom territory, and we have many characters from the films show up. Now, there is a linkage to Philosopher's Stone, so again, like all of these, I think you need to read them in the order of publication. And once again, that crystal skull that appeared there, that disappeared, and I was wondering if it might be recurring, it appears here in the opening prologue sequence. So apparently this is an artifact that McCoy comes back to across his books, and basically Indy keeps not getting a crystal skull. So again, if you didn't like the idea of a crystal skull for the movie that we never mention, well, it was already here being used by Max McCoy in the 1990s. But right here in the prologue, you get that full Indy film flavor because it's Indy dealing with a secret rendezvous, but of course he's already been captured, and he's being interrogated by none other than Renee Belloc, who is there to meet with a secret Nazi submarine because the Nazis want to purchase the crystal skull from him. So you have full Raiders vibes already. You have the Nazis being introduced in the books, finally, because we're getting into the closer to the mid-1930s in the period of the films. You have Belloc in this opening sequence. You have not only the crystal skull, but the previous book's love interest appear here. And then after this prologue, they basically part ways. So it does at least nicely address that last book and sort of closes that door instead of just having characters appear and then never reappear again in another book. And then we jump into the main plot of the book, which is really unrelated to the prologue, but, at least it's an indie beat to open on, even though it kind of feels superfluous. I will note very quickly that all of the characters from the films who appear here and some of the action beats and set pieces, like in Philosopher's Stone, it does seem that in certain aspects McCoy is trying maybe a little bit too hard to sound like the films, because sometimes it feels like it's echoing events and moments from the films too closely instead of just being inspired by them. But that's, I think, better done here, and I think these are better realized than they are in Philosopher's Stone, so you can see McCoy growing as an indie writer. So the book opens then for the main plot with Indy sort of depressed that his last relationship hasn't worked out, and he's struggling along in his teaching career and not sure of what he really wants to do. And of course, he's once again lost the crystal skull. So I like the moments in these books where Indy is just struggling with day-to-day life and, acting like a normal person and having setbacks and hardships and different things. So I like getting into his character that way. But of course, adventure shows up at his front door when Indy is sort of moping in his office, cluttered with things, and of course his office bottle, when who but a nun should show up, and it is the female lead character of the book, Angela Starbuck, who is a nun who is trying to find her missing father, who is Professor Angus Starbuck, who disappeared somewhere in Mongolia, but not before sending back a particular artifact that is of special interest to his daughter, and it sets Indy and the rest of the scientific world afire when they see it and examine it, to find that it is not merely a simple bone or fossil, but it is the bone from a dinosaur, and it actually, for the first ever discovered, is not fossilized, but actually the bone of a living dinosaur. And that sets everyone, both especially Marcus Brody and Indiana Jones, into just complete scientific furor and trying to figure out what exactly this means. And then, of course, how to mount an expedition to Mongolia before word gets out. So that's the main plot thrust of the book. You've got a missing scientist father and the notion that perhaps Indiana Jones is actually going to discover living dinosaurs. It might seem like it's a bit of a stretch to have Indy and dinosaurs. Of course, it's not the first time this book series has had Indy and dinosaurs, because if you remember, the drug trip of Book 6, Interior World, has Indy encounter and fight dinosaurs, among many other things, before being told at the end of the book by Marcus that maybe Indy was just tripping balls for over a year. So the books have had dinosaurs before, but here it's presented in a very plausible manner, and of course it is just remotely possible that there is somehow a single or a few surviving dinosaurs in a very remote part of the world, especially at this point in the 1930s, in uncharted parts of Mongolia, where people are obviously not going due to various conditions. So it makes sense in terms of the of setting up the story. And then as soon as they start trying to mount this expedition, there are obviously forces that start trying to thwart them, right down to actually trying to steal back the bone in the museum. We have many action sequences throughout the book, but this one in the museum I think is really well executed and has such perfect tone and such wonderful bits of business that you read this among all the other action set pieces in this book, and you can visualize them being in an Indiana Jones film. You're actually seeing the Indy film we've never gotten in terms of new action set pieces, and, Indy doing Indy-like things, and it's also got a nice bit of comedy because they wind up basically destroying the main chamber of the museum. And I think bits like this really help to give you that sense of we're finally getting somebody who can get the indie spirit and flavor of the films into print form. So Indy and Sister Angela make their way to start their expedition, and this sort of dynamic between a lead hero and a nun, and of course the developing romantic tensions, really only suggests one thing, and that's two mules for Sister Sara. So that, I think, is the real sort of vibe McCoy was going after. So I think there's a lot of Two Mules for Sister Sara influence here, but it does its own thing, which is nice. But if you know that film, I think you can very much get that sort of dynamic. And of course, you've got Clint Eastwood and Shirley MacLaine in that film, and that their personas are sort of like our characters in the book. And so I think if you know that film, you'll see what McCoy is going for. And it's a nice change of pace. It's not something we've seen Indy have in another story or one of the films. And it's a nice change to the traditional love interest, and you've got that romantic tension that's always on the back burner. They meet up with their expedition head, Granger, who's an old friend of Indy's and seems to be sort of cut from the sort of Alan Quatermain mold, so there's almost a dash of King Solomon's Mines flavor, especially when we're getting into the deep country where basically anything goes, and you've got all kinds of different forces and dangers and untold dangers that awaits the expedition force. As we start to embark on the expedition, we get introduced to more recurring characters from the films. So we have appearances here from major temple faces. We have a whole encounter with Lao Che, and we get to see Indy meet Wuhan for the first time. And actually, Indy manages to free Wuhan from indentured servitude to Lao Che. So that sets up a dynamic there that is not really in Temple of Doom, but it gives a little bit of back history to the character machinations and back and forth and the danger level that's in the opening of Temple of Doom. So, well, I don't know if it's necessarily what I would have done in terms of writing the backstory for these characters. It's a nice approach, and again, all you can do is just read Temple of Doom inferences there, and it's nice to see these characters because Indy is now in that area of the world, a year and a half before Temple of Doom's events, basically. We then see our expedition embark on a long train journey to then get to the deeper parts of Mongolia, where they're basically going to cross the border and then be on their own, but not before agents of Lao Che decide to try and stop and kill them. And we have a nice extended action sequence on the train with a lot of humor that is so full of life and so wonderfully Indian feeling. It makes the stupidity of the overlong, dull as hell train sequence that opens Dial of Destiny look like the piece of boring crud that it is. And you even have Lao Che's assassin basically manning a giant mounted machine gun and blowing the train to shreds, while Indy is muttering under his breath and rapidly diminishing cover. If this does not sound entertaining enough, I don't know what will, and this is merely only one of the sequences in the book that just screams pure Indy flavor. After the train journey that does not go so well, where they basically destroy the train that they rented, we then see our characters then actually go across the border, essentially go into a no man's land of sorts, where we are, of course, also having to deal with the Russians, who have their own interests in the territory, and then the various factions who also are constantly in battle in Mongolia. Particularly, there is the warlord of the area, who seems to have a real stranglehold on the territory and is our primary villain of sorts. Now, the reason why I say villain of sorts is that this character, General C, if I think that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, he's only introduced late in the book and is also in the background. And something you'll find in all the Bantam books so far, or at least I have, is that the villains usually are not very well established, or we don't get their full plot until the very end. In some books, we don't even really get it at all. There are some books where I don't even think there is a primary villain, technically. So it's nice that we do have a nice villainous character eventually, but it does take a while, and then he's only in the book for a certain period. But General C is a warlord, also completely psychotic and insane, and also he and his army of followers are a group of cannibals. So if you didn't think we had fun, pulpy flavor in Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs, oh boy, this builds to a point in which, after much back and forth, our heroes are finally captured and brought in and force-fed psychedelics, and we basically have a scene that almost feels right out of Robert E. Howard or a Conan story, and it's fantastic. But there's a big soup pot full of body parts and a crazy old wizard type figure, and Indy and our heroes are experiencing all kinds of crazy visions, and then there's a pitched battle to get out of there while they're struggling to overcome the psychedelics. So again, I did not expect a scene that felt right out of Robert E. Howard, but wow, was it fantastic. So there's a lot of fun in this book. There's a lot of pulp in this book, but you've got a renegade warlord in Mongolia in 1933 who also has an army of cannibals. What's not to love? While they're basically making their way through the no man's land areas and trying to escape the clutches of General C, Indy and our heroes wind up basically losing most of their caravan and being attacked by various forces. They eventually partner up with the forces of the primary antagonist of the general, who is Shen Khan, who claims to be a descendant of Genghis Khan and is a sort of noble ruler of his people who struggles to fight against the general, and basically they make their living in the desert. And that's our nice sort of local noble supporting character. And there's also another character that both of them almost have a slight Sala level of that type of supporting character who becomes a great friend of Indy's. But it also gives a nice bit of local flavor and also different cultures. And interestingly, I really like how McCoy has their exchange be not merely about monetary gain. Our heroes essentially give Khan various modern vaccines to help treat smallpox amongst his people. So there's a nice feeling of reality there and what the situation would have been like at this time, or at least similar to the situation of this time in this area in 1933. But also, there's some more fun pulpy action because at one point, this is how they meet Khan, actually. The general attacks with his pack of wild, hungry dogs, and our heroes barely manage to survive, and the dogs are a constant threat throughout the book, and they basically tear everything that's standing to shreds. But this also ties into our other supporting character in this book, who is depicted on the cover. If you didn't think we had enough fun Indy material in this book, Indy gets a badass, amazing, fantastic dog partner. He manages to save and rescue a dog that's being horribly mistreated and abused, and then this dog happens to follow Indy and our heroes for the rest of the book and sort of come in and out. He's an older fellow who's been through a lot. He only has one ear, but he has a sort of luck to him, and Indy names him Loki. So Indy has a wild attack dog buddy named Loki in this book, and I love this so much. I wish this was officially canon because Indy needs a dog, because that would just be fantastic. And what's more pulpy than your adventure hero having his attack dog partner? I mean, this just screams classic Phantom, when you have the ghost who walks and Devil his wolf. So that just made me as a Phantom fan really, really ecstatic that Indy has a dog, and he named it Loki, which is a great name for a dog, and I'm just like, I need more of this in my life. Things come to a climax when our heroes eventually get to the end location of the book, where we have basically a surviving group of humans who have never experienced outside culture because they're in such a remote part of the world that's almost preserved and cut off. There's really echoes of Lost Horizon here, and then there's a lot of back and forth discussion about, they know nothing about the outside world, but yet they're all happy, and, maybe we have so much to learn from them. So there's definitely a feeling of Lost Horizon in this final act, and in fact, it's so interesting that you wish there was more of this and this didn't come towards the very end. But also, we don't find out too much about their society, so it's more of just the background for getting to the actual potential dinosaur eggs themselves. And I won't spoil what happens, but it is done in a realistic and believable manner, and they're also having to deal with the remaining forces of the general hunting for them, and also trying to make sure that they don't discover and destroy and forever tarnish this sort of Shangri-La. The ending does eventually play out in the sort of traditional adventure story manner, and does play out in the way you think it will. There are some nice character surprises and things, so it's not predictable, but it's also, thankfully, when you're dealing with, dinosaurs, it's not completely over the top, it's not unrealistic, it's plausible in the story that's presented. So I can definitely say that you can go into this book and no, there's not Indiana Jones running around and riding on dinosaurs and running away from a T-Rex or anything like that, thankfully. No, you can, if you want the crazy town Indiana Jones story, that's Interior World. But here the story plays out the way that it should, except I do think that some of the final character acts are they're not really developed, and they feel a bit sudden just to have more drama going on at the end. So that is a little bit of an issue with character development. I do wish that both in this book and Philosopher's Stone that a lot of our supporting characters had more development. I think this even goes into the lead heroine and love interest as well, who has less character development in this book than the last character did in the Philosopher's Stone, because here she's a nun and she only starts to have more visible human emotions as the story progresses and it comes out over time. And then suddenly we're at the end of the book and it's like, oh wait, oh well, I guess we're done here with this, and now we're just going to do this, and then that's it. So it's plotted well, but I do wish that that there was more character development for all the side characters, and in particular, there's one character trait that suddenly appears at the end and just feels forced, and that does bring down the climax a little bit for me, in terms of that element just feels really forced because it's out of nowhere, and then it's just kind of there to have conflict, and it's like, well, no, this wasn't really established, so it just feels too sudden, and then it just kind of goes away again. So, it does mar the climax a little bit, but that's thankfully more of a minor negative or criticism. So ultimately, I do think this is the closest to the films in tone that we've gotten in the Bantam books up to this point. I do think it is even better than Philosopher's Stone, and of the 10 books so far, I would probably say this is actually the best one yet. I think it's sort of a toss between these two McCoy books being so much more like the films and having the pulp adventure flavor and having Indy's humor and his mutterings and his just real the tone of the films finally. So it's basically between that on one side and then the best of the Rob McGregor books, having all of this great character development and some interesting plot hooks. So I think it's between those which you prefer, but for getting the Indy flavor of a pulp adventure and something like the films, the McCoy books are the ones that really scratch that itch. For the book itself, I have one of the earlier printings from Bantam with beautiful Drew Struzan artwork, as all of these books have, which of course also has the nice wraparound effect because he painted a whole beautiful image, and of course is basing Indy on one of the iconic poses from the film photos. But we have Loki the dog on the cover, and you can see he only has one ear. So I love that not only do we have Indy in action pose, beautifully painted by Struzan, but he even put Loki, Indy's dog, on here. So this just makes me ridiculously happy. If you'll look at the actual font, though, on later printings, they did change the font. So I don't think this is a first printing because the font is a little different, but the more modern versions have more generic fonts. So this one seems to have gone through one or two different runs of those. You'll find that on these Bantam books. They did reprint most of them around the time of Crystal Skull for a brief window, and those had just modernized text and look a little plainer. And then usually the first printings of all the Bantam books have the Indy logo embossed. So I think this is maybe a first or second printing because it's just a little bit different than photos I've seen online. Unfortunately, all the books are out of print, so you're really just lucky to get any copy you can get. But I just love the fact that all of them have beautiful Drew Struzan artwork, and that's one of the biggest reasons why these are so collectible, is that the artwork is so good. So ultimately, Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs, the 10th book of the Bantam novels and the second book written by Max McCoy, is the closest to the films so far of the books, is one of, if not the best book in the series. I'm still trying to figure out my own ranking as I go along. So for me, it's really between this, Philosopher's Stone, and probably maybe Seven Veils and of the McGregor books, and maybe throwing in Genesis Deluge in there as well. Those are like my top ones so far. But this one so far is the closest in tone to the films. This one has the indie flavor. It is a pulp adventure through and through. There is beautiful humor. There are many references and characters from the films. We're getting closer to the actual time of the films. The book is, of course, set in 1933. And this just has loads of pulp flavor. And again, Indy has a dog. And there's a cannibalistic warlord they're dealing with in Mongolia. It's just, this has pure full pulp flavor, and on top of that you have the nice relationship dynamic, which seems very reminiscent of Two Mules for Sister Sara. So this is the most fun of all of the Indy Bantam novels so far. This is an easy recommendation for any Indiana Jones fan. Anybody who loves the Indy films will enjoy this book. Anyone who loves adventure stories will enjoy this book. And it is nothing like the terrible slog of the Martin Caidin books. So I never expected after those terrible books to have something this enjoyable. And it's even better than Philosopher's Stone, which I did really enjoy. So again, this is overall probably the best indie novel so far of the Bantam series. So as always, I hope my babblings about our favorite archaeologist adventurer and the world of Indiana Jones and the Bantam novels have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check these out if you get the chance to. I know they're difficult to find nowadays, but they're really worth your time and quite fascinating, even though your mileage is definitely going to vary with all of the books, with some being ones that really nobody likes. If you've read Dinosaur Eggs, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below and how you think it stacks up to other books in the Bantam series. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores wherever possible, hopefully by being able to pick up some of the Bantam Indiana Jones novels. Keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.